Welcome, U.S. History students, to our continuation of Chapter 15. We are on Section 3, which begins on page 488 in your book. I do want to say before we start that there is a small mistake on your study guide. If you will look at Section 4 on your study guide, right above that it says John Brown's Raid. John Brown's Raid does not belong in Section 3, it belongs in Section 4. So just understand when this video is over and I don't say anything about John Brown's Raid yet, it's because I put it in the wrong section on your study guide. It belongs in Section 4. Having said that, let's begin. We're inching closer to Civil War, and we have a few things to talk about in this section that are going to move us even closer. You probably already know this, maybe just from talking with your parents or listening to the news, but political parties, we've had our political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, for quite a while now, but over the years, just like people change, political parties change, and we're going to come to the time where we get the names of the political parties that we have now, and they're going to kind of stick. They may or may not be exactly the same, the platforms, the things that they believe. And so when I use the word Democrat or I use the word Republican in these chapters, do a little research. Don't necessarily assume that they're exactly the same now as they were then, because they're not. People change and parties change as well. It doesn't mean that some of the things aren't the same, some of the platforms that they still believe. But for the most part, they do morph and they do change. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this process. So in this time period, there is a lot of upheaval, and I'm not just talking about the Civil War, but all of the events that led up to it. Stephen Douglas, and you remember him from our last section, he was a Democrat, and he actually predicted, he said that the Kansas-Nebraska Act would raise a storm, and boy howdy was he right. The Kansas-Nebraska Act brought slavery back into the national spotlight. There were Whigs, Democrats, Free Soilers, and abolitionists that joined together in 1854 to form what they called the Republican Party. This was a political party united against the spread of slavery in the West. They were against the spread of slavery as new states came into the Union. The Democrats, as they knew it at the time, they were in trouble. If they supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they were not reelected, and the Whig Party fell apart. Northern and Southern Whigs would not work together. In fact, there was a senator from Connecticut who said, "The Whig Party has been killed off by that miserable Nebraska business." There were some Whigs and Democrats who joined another party called the American Party. It was also known as the Know Nothing Party. If you want to read something interesting, look that up, the Know Nothing Party. The reason they were called that was because if you asked them what they believed or what their party stood for, they would say, "I know nothing." At the party's convention, delegates argued over slavery and then ended up choosing Millard Fillmore, who was their former president, as their candidate for the election of 1856. The Democrats knew that they could not choose a strong supporter of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, President Pierce or Stephen Douglas. They knew that they couldn't choose one of those men. So they nominated a man named James Buchanan. James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan had been President Polk's Secretary of State, so he had a lot of experience in politics. But even more important than that, he had not been in the country when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was being disputed. He was actually in Great Britain as an ambassador, so he didn't have anything to do with it. So he could claim, and the party could claim for him, that that he was above all that, that he had nothing to do with it one way or another, and he had not been involved in the debate at all. At the nominating convention, the Republicans chose a man named John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont was an explorer. He had no political experience, well, little political experience, but he was absolutely against the spread of slavery. The public, the people, saw the Republican Party as a party that had one platform, one issue. And the Republican Party had almost no support outside the free states because they were so focused on this single issue that nobody saw them as anything else. On Election Day, Buchanan won 14 of the slave states. There were 15 slave states. Buchanan won 14 of them and became the new president. John C. Fremont won 11 states out of 16 free states. Millard Fillmore won only one state, Maryland. And Buchanan won that election. James Buchanan really didn't go down in history yet for doing a lot, to be honest. 2 days after he became president, though, there was an extremely important Supreme Court ruling that was handed down about slavery. This decision threw the country back into crisis. This was not a thing that didn't matter. This was a really, really big deal. The court reviewed and heard and listened to and then decided on a case regarding a man named Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave. He was an enslaved African American man, and you can look on page 489 and read a little bit more about the court case. He was the slave of a man named John Emerson. John Emerson was an army doctor, an army surgeon. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri. You'll remember that Missouri was a slave state. But as an army doctor, he had had tours of duty in lots of different places. And he took his slave, Dred Scott, with him. So he had tours of duty in Illinois. He had tours of duty in Wisconsin Territory. And those were free. That was a free state and a free territory. When they returned home to Missouri, Dr. Emerson died and Dred Scott became the property of the doctor's wife. In 1846, Dred Scott decided to sue for his own freedom. He sued in the Missouri courts, and he said his argument was that he became free when he lived in free territory. Now, there was a lower court that ruled in his favor, but the Missouri Supreme Court overturned that, so Dred Scott's case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, 11 years after he had first sued, in 1857. In 1857, the majority of the Supreme Court justices were from the South, and they had to decide on three main issues with the Dred Scott case. First, they had to rule on whether Dred Scott was actually a U.S. citizen, because only U.S. citizens can could sue in federal court. The second is that the court had to decide if his time living on free soil made him free, and they had to determine whether it was constitutional to ban slavery in parts of the Louisiana Purchase. And the Supreme Court, and we often talk about how the Supreme Court is, kind of has the final say in our country, and that's true most of the time, but not always, and sometimes they get it wrong, and in this case they got it spectacularly wrong. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a man named Roger B. Taney. Roger B. Taney. He was from a slaveholding family in Maryland, and he wrote the majority opinion on the Dred Scott case. he said some things in his majority opinion that are pretty abhorrent. Pretty, as a modern American who understands some things that people didn't understand back then, I look on some of the things that Roger B. Taney said, and I'm like, wow, no, it's not okay. The first thing he did was he talked about whether or not Dred Scott was a citizen. He said, well, Taney said that the nation's founders believed that, and this is a direct quote from, I want to say Taney, it's Taney, Roger B. Taney. He said, and I quote, African Americans had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. He concluded, therefore, that all African Americans, whether they were slave or free, if they were black, they were not citizens under the U.S. Constitution. That is what our Supreme Court decided with Roger B. Taney writing that opinion. Therefore, Dred Scott didn't have the right to even bring the case to court. The court also ruled on the other issues, whether Scott's residence on free soil made him free. They said it didn't. Because Dred Scott had gone back to Missouri, the Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, said his status as free or slave depends on the law of Missouri. And finally, Taney and the Supreme Court declared that the Missouri Compromise restriction on slavery was unconstitutional. Why was it unconstitutional? Well, he said because the Fifth Amendment said that no one could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and because slaves were property, Congress did not have the right to restrict slavery or ban it in any territory. You see where I'm going with this? This guy was a piece of work. He genuinely believed, as many people did during that time, that slaves and African Americans, whether they were slave or free, were not equal in the sight of God. And you and I both know that that is 100% wrong. Most, of course, white Southerners were like, woohoo, this is great, this is awesome. The ruling was absolutely stunning, and not in a good way, to a lot of Northerners. The Republicans were incredibly upset because their platform argued that Congress had the right to ban slavery in the federal territories, and now the Supreme Court says it doesn't. Whew, this is going to be a problem, y'all. Some Northerners were afraid, in fact, that the spread of slavery wouldn't stop with the territories. In fact, there was an Illinois lawyer, you may have heard of this guy, Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois who said that a future court ruling, or what he called the next Dred Scott decision, would prohibit slaves from banning slavery. Here's what he said. He said, "We shall lie down pleasantly dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free, and we shall awake to the reality instead that the 90th Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state." He believed that the next case could possibly result in slavery being legal everywhere. So, in 1858, I want to talk about, just for a second, look on page 491 in your book, and what you have here is a little bit of a primary source. A primary source is a document that was written during the time that it talks about. So primary sources would be like newspapers reporting on current events, would be letters, journals, speeches that people give. Those are primary sources. This was a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave in 1858 to the Illinois Republicans. And here's what he said. "In my opinion, that's disagreement over slavery, will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. Now, this was in 1858, before he was president, before the Civil War. He sort of predicted that we were going to have a crisis, we were going to have a problem, and we were going to become either all one or all the other. In 1858, Illinois Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln as their candidate for U.S. Senate. Okay? His opponent was Democrat Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas had represented Illinois in the Senate since 1847, so he had been in the Senate already for a long time. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates in what would become known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In fact, the form of debate that they had is now a form of debate that you can actually compete in different kinds of competitions. In every debate, Lincoln was very much pressing the idea that the main issue of the campaign was the spread of slavery in the West. He said Democrats were trying to spread slavery across the nation. He talked about the Dred Scott decision. He said, quote, African Americans were entitled to all the natural rights listed in the Declaration of Independence, and he specifically mentioned the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, and you need to understand this because a lot of people believe that, sort of have this idealized view of Abraham Lincoln, and he, like every other man who has ever lived with the exception of Jesus, was not perfect. And Abraham Lincoln himself did not believe that African Americans were necessarily the social or political equals of whites. He didn't believe that they should be slaves, but he didn't necessarily believe they were equal. However, in spite of that, Stephen Douglas, accused Lincoln of believing that the Negro is his brother. That was a quote from Stephen Douglas. Douglas also criticized Lincoln for some other things. He criticized Lincoln for saying the nation could not remain half slave and half free. Douglas said that of course, showed that Lincoln wanted to do away with slavery completely. And he said that this would only lead to a dissolution of the Union and a warfare between the North and the South. Well, ended up he wasn't wrong. The second debate in Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln really pressed Douglas. There was a contradiction that he saw, and he wanted to force Douglas to face this contradiction. And what it was that the Democrats supposedly had this belief in popular sovereignty, which was let each state decide for itself what it believes. And there's a contradiction between popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision. So Lincoln was like, okay, Mr. Douglas, can you explain how Congress can't ban slavery from a federal territory, but it can allow the citizens of the territory to ban it? Douglas said it didn't matter what the Supreme Court decides about it because, quote, the people have the lawful means to introduce it or exclude it as they please for the reason that slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless it is supported by local police regulations. In other words, the police would enforce the decisions of the voters if it contradicted the Supreme Court's decision. And that became known as the Freeport Doctrine. The Freeport Doctrine put the slavery question, again, back in the forefront of the minds of Americans. And it helped Douglas win the Senate seat. Abraham Lincoln lost that Senate race, but he came out as a powerful leader in the Republican Party. Something else, and this is just kind of funny, and I wish I had an illustration here for you. I wish I had somebody here that was 6'4" to show you. But I want you to imagine somebody standing here who's a foot taller than I am. Because Stephen Douglas was 5'4", which is about that much taller than I am. And Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". So Abraham Lincoln was a full foot taller than Stephen Douglas. And one of the funny things about the debates, if you read more about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, is that Stephen Douglas was this really fiery speaker, and he would pace the stage and pound his lectern, and Lincoln, who was literally a foot taller than Douglas, and Douglas was was a short man, and he wasn't fat, he was a little bit pudgy. And Lincoln was tall and very thin, extremely thin. And so this picture of this short, slightly round man, pacing and being really fiery and pounding things and yelling, and then there's Lincoln on the other hand, who is tall and thin and sort of calm and quiet. It was when you read newspaper reports of the debate, it's really interesting to hear the contrast as they talk about the different styles of speaking that these two men had. But it was very interesting because in the end, Douglas won that race. But as we get closer to the Civil War, Lincoln is going to make some progress, and, well, eventually he becomes the president. And we will talk about that in our next section.